Welcome to Global Insights with me, Punita Kumar Sinha. It's a brand new show that we are launching on ET Now, and over the next 2 months, I will turn the spotlight on some of the most important trends shaping the global economy and analyze their impact on India and your life. I start this series by looking at the most important global economy, the US. It's the market that drives all other markets. But over the last 4 years, the US economy has been struggling. Will things get better, and when? On the show today, we take stock of the US economy and find out what the recovery is looking like. And leading economists Ken Rogoff and John Taylor spell out what the US needs to do to bring the economy back on track. First, let's step back and take a look at what triggered the economic crisis in the US and where things stand today. Tanveer Gill has this report.
Nearly 4 years and $2 trillion in stimulus later, the US economy is still struggling to recover from the financial crisis triggered by the collapse of the housing market. Its economy grew at a slower pace of 1.9% in the first quarter of 2012 after logging 3% in the previous quarter.
Risk number one, starting west, is clearly the fiscal cliff in the United States of America, where the deficit and the debt to GDP ratios are worse actually than in the Eurozone.
The unemployment rate is off the peak of 10%, but it's still way too high to signal any recovery in the job market. As a result, consumer spending, which accounts for 70% of the GDP, has weakened too.
We've now created 4.5 million new jobs over the last 29 months. And 1.1 million new jobs so far this year.
The longest period of time we've had unemployment above 8% in American history since this has been recorded. This is an extraordinary record of failure.
The housing market is showing signs of some improvement. Prices and new constructions are looking up in some cities, but most of the market is still very soft.
It's still particularly unbalanced. For example, mortgage rates are at close to 15-year lows, but mortgage demand still remains particularly soft.
American exports, which touched a record of $184 billion, are beginning to slow as Eurozone economies continue to shrink and China becomes the latest big economy to hit the brakes.
Monetary conditions have remained tight for too long. I think the authorities have underestimated the extent of the slowdown. I think that's one very, very important factor.
The euro crisis or American crisis making the consumption in the Western countries is much lower than before. So China as a world factory, so the export industry are greatly affected.
The US Fed has already said that it will keep interest rates at record lows until 2014. But what markets are looking forward to is another round of serious stimulus than just an extension of Operation Twist, which only helps lower long-term interest rates. With presidential elections to be won in November, Barack Obama may err on the side of populism. However, the long-term risk that America faces is that of becoming a broke nation, like the ones in the Eurozone.
And today we will take stock of the US economy with Ken Rogoff, who has served as the chief economist at the IMF, was on the board of Federal Reserve, and currently is professor of economics at Harvard University. Also joining us is John Taylor, who is a former undersecretary of the US Treasury and is currently professor of economics at Stanford University and a noted author. In his most recent book, First Principles, John has stated that having a clear budget strategy, cutting expenditure in a sustainable way, having free markets, and staying away from ad hoc monetary stimulus are important for restoring America's prosperity. John, if I may start with you, you have talked about the US recovery being much slower this time than in previous recessions. Is there a risk of another recession?
Well, the recovery is already just terrible. It's the worst recovery in American history. We had a deep recession, and we've had hardly any growth by standards of our history after that, 2% growth. So it's hovering on the recession level and has been for the last 3 years. That's the real biggest concern for the United States. We're really not recovering as we did in the past. And I believe it's because of these unpredictable policies, the short-term stabilizations. Sometimes we call it a fiscal cliff. Everything at the end of this year is going to change in ways nobody knows. So that's the problem with the U.S. economy. It really does risk another recession, but in the meantime, the performance is bad. Very high unemployment, very high long-term unemployment, and very low job growth.
What signs would you be looking for to say that the economic recovery is now sustainable?
Well, the most important thing is to have faster growth. That would be growth of 4%, 4.5%, even 5% for a while, because that's what we saw in after previous deep recessions. And right now we're not seeing that. If anything, people are reducing their forecasts. They're downgrading the growth rates. The most recent quarter in the United States was just 1.5% growth. So it's getting worse rather than better. So I think in terms of other kinds of indications, when policy changes, and if there is a change in policy, I think you'll see a response in the private sector, a response to that. But so far there's not a sign of that on the horizon. We'll just have to see what happens.
Ken, turning to you, in your book, you have discussed that recessions caused by financial crises can take a decade for recovery. Is this a typical recession or one that will take a long time for recovery?
Well, it's hard to call it completely typical when we're experiencing the worst recession, the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. But yes, in many ways, what we have experienced, but only on a larger scale, has been very typical of post-war recessions, both the build-up and the credit boom that we had beforehand, but also, very importantly, the slow, halting recovery that happens afterwards. Instead of taking a year, can take a decade or longer. And it's an exaggeration and too sweeping to say it's totally typical. There are ways in which it's different. But in the big picture, it is remarkably similar to other deep financial crises.
Is this then as bad as the Great Depression? Stay with us as we discuss this after the break. Welcome back. You're watching Global Insights with me, Punita Kumar Sinha. And today we will take stock of the U.S. economy with Ken Rogoff and John Taylor. John, the big issue that everyone is worried about is the fiscal cliff, given that it can further hurt growth in the short term. What do you think governments should be doing about the fiscal cliff?
Well, my hope is that Washington will come together and recognize that fiscal cliffs are not good policy. Remember, the fiscal cliff didn't come from outer space. The fiscal cliff was a policy decision. Politicians in Washington decided that they were going to have everything expire on the same date. So they have to stop doing that. And the most important thing is to stretch it out and then reform. Put in some permanent tax reforms, stop all this short-term stuff, put in some, as I mentioned, put in a budget strategy that gradually reduces the recent spending binge we've had, and do it in a sustainable way, not just a temporary way. And that will solve the fiscal cliff. My concern is the fiscal cliff is just going to be pushed out a little bit further. It's not going to be removed, and it will just have the same old, same old. So that's the big question going forward for the United States.
Do you believe then in bridging the cliff or removing it completely?
Well, no, the fiscal cliff itself is very bad policy. So that shouldn't go. You shouldn't let that happen. You shouldn't jump over the cliff, if you like. But on the other hand, just moving the cliff out 6 months is not going to solve anything, because you'll be 6 months there again, or even 12 months. It really needs to be addressed on a longer-term sustainable basis. So you got to remove the cliff. You can't just bridge it over it. You got to remove it.
Ken, would you also say that the fiscal cliff is a bad idea?
Yeah, I mean, this is a poison pill that Congress has passed, thinking that that would get them to do something, but of course it didn't. I don't think anybody seriously expects them to jump all the way off this cliff or to do this. I don't really think many in Congress really think this is a good idea. It's clearly something we want to stretch out over a very long period. The decision really is, do you raise taxes, which I think President Obama is advancing, or do you cut government spending, which candidate Romney is saying is his favorite alternative? I think it's pretty clear you have to have both. I don't think there's any simple way out of this, but I don't think we'll end up jumping off the fiscal cliff, although we may dangle a foot over it.
Is this then as bad as the Great Depression?
Well, it isn't as bad as the Great Depression, and the people who sort of said we're about to have the Great Depression, I think that was exaggerated. The world was a very different place back then than it is today. I mean, that said, these post-war financial crisis recessions have been stunning, and I think too many people were focused on just looking at United States recessions or their home country and not looking broadly enough around the world. The problem is this doesn't happen very often. They don't come around, so often in most countries. And so if you're just going to look at what happened in one country, it doesn't give you much basis for comparison.
So in the event, if the U.S. is not able to cut expenditures and raise taxes soon, how are we going to reduce the deficit and the high debt?
Right now, if you look at the United States and the United Kingdom, they're running very large deficits, 8% of GDP. That's a big number, maybe not in India, but for most of the world, that's a very big number by historical circumstances. They've come down a little bit, but they've been high for a long time. I certainly would not advise closing the gap any faster than current plans. I would first say that clearly there's credit retrenchment in the private sector, and second, we don't understand these things so well, they don't come around that often, that you don't want to respond dramatically. It's probably important not to try to bring it down super fast, say jump off the fiscal cliff that some are talking about in the United States, but in a calibrated way. And at the same time, I just don't agree with those people who say, well, we're running an 8% deficit, why not a 15% deficit? I think that's a very risky proposition.
John, if you're in this very slow recovery that is taking so long, would you still say that ad hoc monetary stimulus is a bad idea? Do you think there will be QE3, and why do you think it will not help?
Well, there could very well be. Most recently, they have decided to not go ahead with the QE3, but in future meetings they may. The reason why I think it's basically harmful is it becomes a whole issue of speculation in itself. The markets are trying to speculate, will there be a QE3, will there not be a QE3? That takes attention away from the real fundamentals in the market. What are profits going to be? What is tax policy going to be? So right now, effectively, the Fed has replaced the markets with itself. And you don't know what will happen. You lost a lot of the way markets work because of that. So I think basically it's not helpful and likely to be harmful, and I hope as soon as possible the Fed gets back to the kind of policies that worked really well in the 80s and 90s. I was one of the biggest champions of the Fed in that period, and I think we would have a much better economy if that happened.
Ken, you seem to be more in favor of monetary stimulus. What would that do to inflation?
Well, to put it bluntly, I favor having more inflationary monetary policy, and we can get into a technical discussion